Have you ever wondered why the silence that follows a catastrophe feels heavier than the noise that caused it? We are told that history is written by the victors, but what if the victors are not writing history, but rather erasing it? There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a city when it has been turned not just into ruins, but into dust, a silence that hums with the vibration of secrets that have been forcibly removed from the world. We stand at the edge of such a void tonight. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, down in the dark of the comments, where are you listening from, and what is the time on your clock as we step into the ashes? The year is 146 BC. The location is the northern tip of Africa, looking out over the Mediterranean Sea. The air is not breathable. It is thick, choking, and grey, filled with the particulate matter of cedarwood, limestone, tapestry, and flesh. The city of Carthage, the jewel of the Phoenician world, the great rival that had made Rome tremble for 100 years, is burning. It has been burning for 17 days. This is not a simple fire. This is a cremation. And standing on a hill, watching the inferno consume the skyline, is the man responsible for it all. Scipio Aemilianus. He is the conqueror. He has achieved what his grandfather could not. He has finally, utterly destroyed the beast. The Senate in Rome is cheering. The legions are looting. But Scipio is not cheering. According to the historian Polybius, who stood at his shoulder, Scipio was weeping. He was gripping the hand of his friend, his face wet with tears, trembling not with the adrenaline of victory, but with a profound, crushing melancholia. Why? Why does a general weep when he has won the ultimate prize? It is said that in that moment, watching the great walls of Carthage collapse into the flames, Scipio did not see Carthage. He saw Rome. He turned to Polybius and recited lines from Homer's Iliad, whispering them into the smoky wind. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain. This is the mystery we must unravel tonight. Scipio realized in the heat of the destruction that all things are cyclical. He understood the terrifying mechanics of the great year, the cosmic cycle where civilizations rise, ripen, rot, and are burned away to make room for the next. He wept because he knew that by destroying Carthage, he was setting the clock for the destruction of Rome. He was looking at his own future in the burning reflection of his enemy. But was there something else? Was there something in the way Carthage burned that terrified him? Consider the ferocity of the destruction. The Senate had issued a decree. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Not conquered, not occupied, not taxed. Destroyed. Why this absolute imperative? The wars were over. Carthage was disarmed. They had handed over their weapons, their ships, their hostages. They were a shadow of their former self. Yet Rome demanded erasure. This suggests a fear that goes beyond military strategy. It suggests a fear of an idea, a lineage, or perhaps a knowledge that Carthage possessed, something that Rome felt it could not coexist with. When the legions finally breached the walls after 3 years of siege, the fighting moved from the streets to the rooftops. It was a vertical war. The historian Appian tells us that the Romans had to bridge the gaps between the tall, apartment-like buildings with planks, fighting suspended in the air above the screaming crowds. It was a slaughterhouse. But the final act, the burning, feels like a ritual purification. The fire was fed. It was maintained. For 17 days. This is the time it takes to ensure that nothing remains but ash. What happens to a culture when it is subjected to this temperature? Stone cracks, gold melts, but parchment vaporizes. The records, the histories, the genealogies of the Punic people were not just lost, They were transmuted into smoke. We often think of the burning of the Library of Alexandria as the great tragedy of the ancient world, but the burning of Carthage was perhaps a more thorough lobotomy of human history. The Carthaginians were explorers. They were the masters of the Atlantic. They had gone where the Romans dared not go. By burning the city, Rome was burning the maps. They were closing the horizon, shrinking the world back to a size that they could control. Scipio watched the Byrsa, the citadel, the heart of the city, finally surrender to the flames. He saw the last resistance, 50,000 starving survivors, marched out into slavery, but he also saw the wife of the Carthaginian commander, Hasdrubal. Her name is lost to us, or perhaps erased. The story goes that while her husband surrendered to Scipio begging for his life, she stood on the roof of the burning temple of Eshmun. She was dressed in her finest robes. She held her children by the hand. She looked down at her husband, then at Scipio, and shouted a curse. She called her husband a coward. She called Scipio a predator. And then, with a calmness that defies biological instinct, she cut the throats of her children and threw herself into the fire. This image haunted the Romans. It was cited as proof of Punic madness, of their barbarism. But look closer. In the flickering light of that temple fire, do we see madness, or do we see an absolute refusal to be possessed? She chose the fire over the chain. She chose to become part of the smoke, to become ungraspable. It is a moment of dark sovereignty. It raises the question, what is the price of survival? If the only way to survive is to become a slave to a power you despise, is extinction a valid choice? The smoke of Carthage drifted across the Mediterranean. It is said the haze could be seen for miles at sea. It was a signal fire telling the world that the old order was dead. The Semitic power in the west was broken. The era of the merchant princes was over. The era of the soldier bureaucrats had begun. But in the silence that followed the fire, when the last wall had crumbled and the ground was hot to the touch, something strange happened. The Romans didn't just leave. They stayed to ensure the silence held. They organised the rubble. They levelled the playing field, quite literally. There is a theory in geology and archaeology called catastrophism, the idea that the world is shaped not by slow, gradual erosion, but by sudden, violent events that rewrite the landscape in an instant. The fall of Carthage was a man-made catastrophe. It was a localized apocalypse, and like all apocalypses, it created a boundary line. Before 146 BC, there were two possibilities for the future of the West: the commercial, maritime, multicultural network of Carthage, or the rigid agrarian militaristic hierarchy of Rome. After 146 BC, there was only one. We are living in the timeline of Rome. We are the children of Scipio's tears. But what if the wrong side won? This is the dangerous thought that whispers in the night. What if the knowledge lost in that fire was the key to a different way of being human? A way that was less obsessed with domination and more attuned to the flow of trade and the stars. We cannot know. The ash covers everything. But as Scipio wept, perhaps he sensed that by destroying the other, Rome was condemning itself to a solitary madness. Without a mirror, without a rival, the empire would eventually turn its appetite upon itself. The fire dies down, the screams fade, the soldiers begin to sort the loot, but the ground is unstable. Beneath the charred stones and the fused glass, there are cavities, cellars, cisterns, hidden chambers that the fire did not reach. In these air pockets, the silence waits. We have watched the city fall, but we have not yet walked through its streets as they were. To understand what was lost, we must go back before the fire. We must reconstruct the ghost. We must walk into the city that vanished, the metropolis that defied the logic of the ancient world. The smoke clears, and we see the outline of a harbour, a circle of water that looks like a giant eye staring up at the indifferent sky. If you close your eyes and listen to the ground beneath the modern suburbs of Tunis, past the noise of the traffic and the wind coming off the Gulf, can you hear the hum of the ghost? We are told that Carthage was destroyed, and in our minds destruction implies a pile of rubble, a chaotic heap of stone. But the destruction of 146 BC was not just a demolition, it was an act of aggressive smoothing. The Romans wanted to turn a three-dimensional marvel into a two-dimensional plane. They wanted to unmake the geometry of a civilization. But geometry is hard to kill. Even now, if you look at satellite imagery of the Tunisian coast, you can see a strange, unnatural shape carved into the land. A perfect circle, connected to a rectangle, filled with the dark water of the sea. It looks like a keyhole cut into the earth. This is the Kothon, and it is the fingerprint of the invisible metropolis. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must reconstruct the city in the theatre of the mind, building it back up from the silence. Forget the Rome of marble statues and open forums for a moment. Carthage was different. It was vertical. The ancient writers tell us of buildings that rose 6 stories high, towering apartment complexes constructed of limestone and wood, separated by narrow winding streets that created a constant cool shadow. This was a city of density, a city of perhaps 700,000 people, a number that seems impossible for the ancient world, a population that rivals modern cities. While Rome was still a sprawl of wooden huts and brick, Carthage was already a Manhattan of the Mediterranean. But the heart of this machine was the water. The Kothon was not just a harbour. It was a feat of engineering that defies the barbarian narrative Rome tried to sell to the future. Imagine 2 distinct harbours, the outer one rectangular for the merchants, a chaotic, vibrant forest of masts where tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic and ivory from Africa changed hands. But pass through a narrow channel, sealed by heavy iron chains, and you enter the inner sanctum, the military harbour. It was perfectly circular. In the centre of this circle stood an artificial island, the Admiralty, where the High Commander watched the fleet. This was not a parking lot for boats, it was a clockwork mechanism. Around the perimeter of the circle and on the island itself were 220 dry docks, ship sheds carved into the stone. Each shed was framed by 2 ionic columns. From the water, looking in, it didn't look like a naval base. It looked like a continuous curved colonnade, a temple to the sea god, hiding the teeth of the empire. Inside, the ships were not just stored. They were maintained by an industrial system that feels startlingly modern. Archaeologists have found evidence of prefabricated parts, bits of hull and keel marked with letters and numbers. They weren't building ships one by one, they were assembling them. This was mass production, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. How does a culture labelled as primitive or cruel by its conquerors possess the sophistication to build a hydraulic machine of this scale? The Romans were masters of land, roads, legions, forts. But the Carthaginians were masters of the liquid world. They understood hydrostatics, dredging, and the complex management of water levels. The existence of the Kothon suggests a level of mathematical and architectural knowledge that was dangerous to Rome. It wasn't just that Carthage had ships, it was that they had a system that could produce fleets faster than Rome could sink them. Was the total destruction of this harbour an act of military necessity, or was it the destruction of a technology? When Scipio burned the sheds, was he trying to burn the blueprint? The city itself was wrapped in a triple layer of walls, a fortification so massive it functioned as a linear city in itself. These weren't just stone barriers. The walls were hollow. Inside them were barracks for 20,000 infantry and stables for 4,000 horses and 300 war elephants. Think of the logistics required to maintain a zoo and an army inside a wall. The drainage, the ventilation, the food supply. It implies a mastery of urban planning that was lost for 1,000 years. When the Romans levelled these walls, they didn't just knock them down, they dismantled a complex biological containment system. Walking through the reconstructed streets in our mind, we notice something else: the smell. Not the stench of the ancient world, but the scent of cedar and citron. Carthage was a clean city. They had paved streets, advanced cisterns, and complex sewage systems long before Rome perfected its aqueducts. They had a culture of washing, of perfume, derived from their Phoenician ancestors who traded in rare dyes and oils. The Romans, in their early rugged austerity, viewed this as effeminate, as luxury, but perhaps it was simply civilization. Rome's hatred was partly the hatred of the rough provincial for the sophisticated cosmopolitan. They burned the city because it made them feel small. There is a mystery in the silence of the residential quarters. Excavations on the Berza Hill have revealed beautiful mosaic floors intact beneath the layer of ash. They depict the sign of Tanit, a triangle with a circle and a horizontal bar and intricate geometric patterns. But where are the statues of the people? We have thousands of Roman busts, stern men with veristic wrinkles. We know exactly what Caesar looked like. But what did a Carthaginian shopkeeper look like? What did the admiral of the fleet look like? There is a strange lack of representational art of the human form compared to the Greeks or Romans. Was this a religious prohibition? A Semitic avoidance of graven images? Or have the statues simply been ground into dust? The erasure of the Carthaginian face creates a psychological distance. It is easier to accept the destruction of a people you cannot look in the eye. Rome ensured that we would never see them. They left us the masks of the demons they claim the Carthaginians worshipped, the grotesque terracotta grins found in graves, but they destroyed the portraits of the living. We are left with a city of ghosts who have no faces. And what of the secrets hidden in the layout of the city? Some scholars have suggested that the circular harbour was not just functional, but symbolic, a representation of the cosmos, or a sundial on a massive scale. The Phoenicians were obsessed with the stars, their navigation depended on it. Was the city aligned to specific celestial events? When the smoke finally cleared in 146 BC, and the Roman surveyors moved in to redraw the map, they imposed a grid. The Roman grid is aggressive. It ignores the terrain. It imposes right angles on nature. They paved over the organic, winding, star-aligned streets of Carthage with the heavy square logic of the legion. They buried the sacred geometry beneath a mundane one, but the ground remembers. In the damp soil near the lagoons, archaeologists still find layers of crushed murex shells, the source of the Tyrian purple dye. Millions of shells, the waste product of an industry that coloured the robes of kings. The smell of that dye, a mix of garlic and rotting fish, was the smell of money. Carthage was the broker of the world. They sat at the choke point of the Mediterranean. To destroy this city was to cut the artery of global trade. Rome didn't just want the territory, they wanted to stop the flow. They wanted a world that was static, agrarian and controlled, not a world that was fluid, mercantile and open. The invisible metropolis still waits beneath the surface. Every time a foundation is dug in modern Carthage, something emerges. A stele, a lamp, a charred piece of wood. These are the fragments of the puzzle Rome tried to scramble. But a city is more than its stones. A city is a repository of information. The walls and the harbour were just the hardware. The software of Carthage, the collective mind of its people, was stored elsewhere. As we move from the harbour to the centre of the city, we approach the citadel and within it, the place where the true danger lay. Not in the elephants, not in the ships, but in the scrolls. Rome could tolerate a rival army. They had defeated many. But could they tolerate a rival history? Fire is a hungry creature. It consumes wood and flesh with a loud, crackling appetite, but when it consumes paper, papyrus, or leather scrolls, it makes a different sound. A soft, whispering hiss, a sudden flare of brightness, and then nothing. Just a flake of black ash that floats on the thermal current, lighter than a feather. If you were standing in the citadel of Carthage in those final days of 146 BC, amidst the screams and the crashing timber, you might have seen a peculiar black snow falling over the ruins. These were not snowflakes. They were the pages of the history of the world turning into carbon. We have spoken of the walls and the harbour, the hardware of the empire, but now we must walk into the smoke to find the software, the mind of Carthage. We must enter the library of ash. It is a detail often forgotten in the footnotes of military history. Carthage possessed immense libraries. This was a civilization of scribes, merchants, and explorers. They wrote everything down. They had records of trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world, astronomical tables inherited from the Babylonians, histories of the gods, and philosophies that might have rivaled the Greeks. When the Romans broke into the citadel, they found these libraries intact. And then a decision was made. A decision that changed the trajectory of human knowledge. The Roman Senate decreed that the city was to be levelled. But what of the books? Most were fed to the fire. But a select few were not. And the choice of what to save and what to burn tells us exactly what Rome feared. They saved only one author. His name was Mago. He was a Carthaginian aristocrat, a retired general, who had written a massive 28-volume encyclopedia on agriculture. It was the ultimate guide to farming, how to prune vines, how to breed horses, how to manage olive groves, how to maximize the yield of the North African soil. The Roman Senate, in a rare act of respect, ordered this specific work to be translated into Latin immediately. It became the textbook for Roman farming for centuries. Think about the cynicism of this choice. Rome burned the poetry, they burned the history, they burned the religion, they burned the star charts, but they saved the manual on how to exploit the land. They wanted the Carthaginian soil to feed Rome, but they did not want the Carthaginian soul to survive. They extracted the utility and incinerated the identity. It is a terrifying kind of surgery. By saving Mago, they proved they could read the Punic texts, that they understood their value. The destruction of the rest was not an accident of war, it was a curated erasure. What was in the books that burned? What knowledge was considered so dangerous that it had to be vaporized? We must look to the sea for the answer. The Carthaginians were the lords of the horizon, while the Romans and Greeks hugged the coastlines, terrified of the open ocean. The Punic captains sailed into the deep, blue. We know of two famous explorers whose logs were likely in that library, Hanno and Himilco. Hanno the navigator sailed south, down the coast of West Africa, perhaps as early as the 5th century BC. We have a fragmented, condensed Greek translation of his voyage, a periplus, but the original detailed log was likely in the library. He describes rivers of fire flowing into the sea, possibly volcanoes in Cameroon. He describes hairy women whom the interpreters called gorillae, our first encounter with the great apes. But how far did he really go? Did he circumnavigate Africa 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama? The maps that would have proven this were turned to ash. And then there is Himilco, who sailed north to the Tin Isles, Britain, and perhaps beyond. But the true mystery lies in the west. The Atlantic Ocean was known as the Sea of Darkness. It was terrifying to the ancient mind. But there are persistent whispers. anomalies in the archaeological record that suggest the Carthaginians knew a secret. There are stories of Phoenician coins found in the Azores, islands far out in the Atlantic. There are disputed carvings in the Americas that bear a resemblance to Punic script. Did the Library of Carthage contain the charts to the New World? This is not as impossible as it sounds. The Carthaginians practiced a state policy known as the Phoenician secret. They would drown their own ships rather than let a rival follow them to a new trade source. They spread rumours of sea monsters and boiling waters to keep the Greeks and Romans away from the Straits of Gibraltar. Knowledge of the winds and currents was a state secret, punishable by death if revealed. The library was the vault where these secrets were kept. By burning the charts, Rome didn't just blind Carthage, they blinded the world. They locked humanity into the Mediterranean for another 1,500 years. The Atlantic became a wall again, instead of a highway. Imagine the master map of the Carthaginian Admiralty unrolling on a table in the library. It might have shown the trade winds. It might have shown the Sargasso Sea. It might have shown a coastline to the west that shouldn't exist. When the Roman soldier held his torch to that parchment, he wasn't just burning a map. He was burning the shape of the planet. He was shrinking the earth back to the size of the Roman imagination. The tragedy deepens when we learn that not all the books were burned immediately. Some were given away. The Roman sources tell us that the minor libraries were gifted to the Numidian kings, the allies of Rome in Africa. They were carted off to the desert courts of North Africa, and there they slowly disappeared, eaten by worms, lost in sandstorms, or burned in later wars. It is a slow, agonizing fade. We have references in later Roman works to Punic books, owned by King Juba II, a scholar king who married the daughter of Cleopatra. He referenced them in his own histories, but then Juba's works were lost too. It is a cascade of silence, a library inside a library, all gone. There is something deeply unsettling about the loss of a language's literature. Punic was a Semitic language, a sister to Hebrew. It had a rhythm, a poetry, a way of describing the divine and the human that was distinct from the Indo-European languages of Greek and Latin. When the books burned, the internal monologue of a civilization was silenced. We know what the Romans thought of the Carthaginians. They called them treacherous, cruel, punica fides. Punic faith became a slur for lying. But we will never know what the Carthaginians thought of the Romans. We will never hear their side of the story. The defendant was gagged before he was executed. In the rising heat of the burning library, we might imagine the spectre of a priest or a scholar trying to smuggle one last scroll out under his robe. But the cordon was tight. The smoke was thick. The knowledge of the navigational stars, the treaties with lost tribes, the recipes for industrial dyes, the architectural blueprints of the hollow walls, all of it rose up in that black column of smoke, drifting out over the bay to dissolve into the sea. Rome wanted to be the only source of truth. To build their eternal city, they had to ensure that no other version of the past survived to contradict them. But there is one subject that Rome did not want to forget. There was one aspect of Carthaginian life that they did not burn, but rather amplified, shouted from the rooftops, and carved into the public consciousness. It was the accusation that justified the fire, the horror that made the erasure necessary. As the library turns to ash, we must turn our gaze to the most controversial, the most blood-soaked ground in Carthage. We must leave the silence of the books and enter the silence of the sanctuary. We must ask the question that has divided historians for centuries. Did they really kill their children? Or was this the ultimate lie told by the victor to justify the genocide? The firelight flickers on the small stone markers of the Tophet, and the shadows seem to move. There are some secrets that the earth refuses to keep. While the books turned to smoke and the maps dissolved into the wind, there is one archive in Carthage that was made of harder stuff. It was not written on papyrus but in bone and clay. We leave the high citadel now, the place of administration and order, and we descend into the lower city near the commercial harbour. We enter a walled enclosure open to the sky, a place where the sun beats down on thousands of small upright stones. This is the Tophet, and it is here that the silence of Carthage becomes deafening. It is here that we must confront the shadow that Scipio used to justify his fire. For 2,000 years the Romans and Greeks told a story about the Carthaginians that was so horrific, so repugnant to the human spirit, that it effectively ejected them from the family of civilized nations. They claimed that in times of great crisis, plague, siege, or famine, the people of Carthage would gather in this sanctuary to offer their most precious possession to the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. They claimed that the Carthaginians sacrificed their own children. For a long time, modern historians dismissed this as the ultimate propaganda. It felt too convenient. Of course the Romans said that, we whispered to ourselves. It is the classic tactic of the victor. Dehumanize the enemy to justify the genocide. We wanted to believe that the Romans were lying, that this was just another blood libel invented to make the destruction of 146 BC feel like a moral necessity rather than a geopolitical crime. We preferred to think of the Tophet as a cemetery, a sad but innocent garden for the stillborn and the sickly, where grieving parents buried the little ones who died of unnatural causes in a world where infant mortality was high. It is a comforting thought. It restores our faith in the universality of parental love. But the earth, when we ask it, gives a different answer. In the early 20th century, and continuing into the modern era, archaeologists began to dig beneath the stelae, the small stone monuments carved with the symbol of Tanit. They found urns, thousands of them, packed tight layer upon layer, generation upon generation. Inside the urns were the calcined remains of children, mostly infants, but some 2 or 3 years old, and mixed in with them the bones of lambs and kids, young goats. The analysis of these bones is difficult to listen to. The forensics suggest that the fire was incredibly hot, and the pattern of the bone shrinkage implies that the flesh was still present when they burned. But the most damning evidence is not in the bones. It is in the stone. The inscriptions on the stelae do not read like tombstones. A tombstone says, "Here lies." It is a memorial to a life lost, but these stones say, "To the Lady Tanit and the Lord Baal Hammon, that which he vowed, because he heard his voice and blessed him, that which he vowed." This is the language of a transaction, not a funeral. It is a mulk, a sacrificial offering. In the ancient Semitic world, a vow was a contract. You asked the god for a favour, a safe voyage, a good harvest, victory in battle, and you promised something in return. If the god delivered, you had to pay. The horror of the Tophet is that the currency of this payment was life. We must try to suspend our modern judgment for a moment, to step into the terrifying internal logic of the Carthaginian mind. This was not cruelty. Cruelty is the infliction of pain for pleasure. This was something far heavier. This was piety. They believed, with a shivering intensity, that the gods held the world in a fragile balance. To keep the sun rising, to keep the ships floating, to keep the walls standing, the gods required energy. And the most potent energy, the most valuable thing a human being could possess, was their progeny. To give a sheep was a small thing. To give a child was to tear out your own heart and place it on the altar. It was the ultimate proof of submission. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus describes a bronze statue of the god Kronos, Baal, with hands sloped downward, so that when the child was placed upon them, they would roll into a pit of fire below. He writes that the flutes and drums played loudly to drown out the screaming. Is this true, or is it a fever dream of the Greeks? We have found no such mechanical statue, but the urns remain. The sheer number of them, estimated at over 20,000, suggests this was not a fringe cult. This was a state institution, and disturbingly, the density of the urns increases during times of trouble. When the enemy was at the gate, the fires burned brighter. There is a chilling detail in the analysis of the stelae. The names on the stones belong to the aristocracy, the rich, the powerful. This was not a ritual where the poor were forced to give up their children to satisfy the superstitions of the elite. It seems to have been the opposite. The elite believed that their blood was the most potent, and therefore their sacrifice was the most necessary. The burden of saving the city fell on those who had the most to lose. Imagine the psychology of a ruling class that believes its power is purchased with the ashes of its own offspring. It creates a hardness, a resolve that is difficult for us to comprehend. This brings us back to Scipio standing on the hill. When the Romans looked at Carthage, they didn't just see a rival economy, they saw a moral abomination. The Romans were brutal, they enjoyed the slaughter of the arena, they practiced slavery on an industrial scale, but they had a taboo against human sacrifice. They viewed it as a chaotic, archaic darkness that had to be purged. In their minds, the destruction of Carthage was a theological policing action. They were correcting a mistake in the moral fabric of the world. But is there a hypocrisy here? The Romans sacrificed thousands of men in the Colosseum to the spirits of the dead. The original purpose of the gladiatorial games. They exposed unwanted infants on hillsides to die of exposure. Is the difference merely one of method? One culture kills for entertainment and social order, the other kills for divine favour. Both cultures walked knee-deep in blood. The Tophet today is a quiet place. The bougainvillea grows over the stones. The sun is warm. It is hard to reconcile the peace of the garden with the violence of the history. But the question lingers, what happens to a society that institutionalizes this kind of trauma? If you have given your firstborn to the fire to save the city, how fiercely will you fight to defend that city? You have invested your own biological future into the stones of the walls. This creates a specific kind of desperation, a sunk cost fallacy on a spiritual level. Perhaps this explains the tenacity of Carthage, why they rose again and again after defeat. They had paid too much to simply surrender. The soil was mixed with their own DNA. We must also consider the silence of the mothers. The history is written by men, the Roman senators, the Greek travellers, the Carthaginian fathers who commissioned the stelae. But where is the voice of the woman who stood in the smoke? Did she believe? Did she weep? Or did she, like the wife of Hasdrubal on the roof of the temple, possess a steel in her soul that we find terrifying? The erasure of her voice is perhaps the deepest silence of all. As the sun sets over the Tophet, the shadows of the stelae stretch out like fingers pointing towards the sea. We have looked at the cost of Carthaginian power. We have seen the price they were willing to pay for favour. But favour is a fickle thing. The gods may drink the offering and still refuse the request. There was one man who was born into this atmosphere of intense sacrificial expectation, a man who carried the weight of this blood debt on his shoulders. He was not a sacrifice in the fire, but a sacrifice on the battlefield. He was the ghost who had come to haunt Rome, the manifestation of all the fear and trauma stored in these urns. To understand the fall, we must understand the man who almost made Rome fall first. We must look into the eyes of Hannibal. There are some names that, when spoken, do not just make a sound, they drop the temperature in the room. In the long, feverish dream of Roman history, there was one figure who functioned not as a man, but as a recurring nightmare, a shadow that stood at the foot of the bed for centuries, reminding the empire of its own mortality. We have walked through the ashes of the city, we have touched the stones of the harbour, and we have recoiled from the urns of the Tophet. But to understand why Rome burned Carthage with such pathological thoroughness, we must understand the terror that preceded the fire. We must look for the ghost of Hannibal. He's often remembered as a genius of tactics, a man of maps and elephants, the architect of the double envelopment at Cannae. But tonight, let us not look at the battles. Let us look at the trauma. Let us consider Hannibal not as a soldier, but as a psychological weapon. The story begins in the flickering light of a temple, perhaps the very Tophet we just left. The historian Polybius tells us the famous scene. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, leads his 9-year-old son to the altar. He makes the boy place his hand on the sacrificial victim, perhaps dipping it in the warm blood. He demands an oath, never to be a friend to Rome. We often read this as a pledge of hatred, but look closer. It was a pledge of negation. Hannibal was raised to be the anti-Rome. He was constructed layer by layer to be the antidote to Italian ambition. This was not just a political stance, it was a religious vocation. He was the grace of Baal, which is what Hannibal means, sent to balance the scales. When he crossed the Alps, he did something more damaging than simply invading territory. He violated the Roman sense of reality. The Romans believed in boundaries. They believed the mountains were a wall placed by the gods to keep their world safe. By bringing an army and 37 elephants over the snow-capped peaks, Hannibal shattered the illusion of Roman safety. He turned the impossible into the inevitable. Imagine the psychological impact on the Roman mind. Waking up to find monsters from the African savannah walking through the mist of the Po Valley. It was a surrealist intrusion. For 15 years he wandered through Italy. This is a staggering amount of time. A child born when Hannibal arrived would be ready to hold a spear by the time he left. He was not just an invader, he was a resident disease, a roaming catastrophe that could not be cured. He defeated them at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and then the unthinkable, Cannae. In a single afternoon, 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were butchered. The aristocracy was decimated. It is said that Hannibal's brother poured a bushel of gold rings onto the floor of the Senate in Carthage, rings taken from the fingers of dead Roman senators. After Cannae, a silence fell over Rome. It was the silence of a generation wiped out. They banned the word peace. They limited mourning to 30 days because if they allowed everyone to mourn who needed to, the whole city would be paralyzed with grief. This is where the scar was formed. This is where the fear of Carthage mutated into a mania. Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a phrase used to frighten naughty children for centuries. He became the boogeyman. But here lies the tragedy and the mystery of the missing piece. Hannibal broke Rome's armies, but he could not break Rome's resolve, and crucially, he could not get help from home. This is the great question mark over his life, the silence of Carthage. While he was ravaging Italy, begging for siege engines to take Rome, begging for reinforcements, the merchant princes back in Carthage sent almost nothing. Why? Perhaps the oligarchy in Carthage feared Hannibal more than they feared Rome. He was a creature of the army, a monarch in all but name. They were men of ledgers and trade. They worried that if he returned victorious, he would become a tyrant. It is the classic tension between the warrior and the merchant. They starved their own protector because they could not control him. There is a profound loneliness in the figure of Hannibal standing on the hills overlooking Rome, knowing he could take the city if he just had the tools, and looking south toward a home that had turned its back on him. He was undefeated by the Romans, but defeated by the silence of his own people. When he finally returned to Africa to face Scipio, the man who had studied Hannibal's tactics like a holy text, the end was inevitable. At Zama, the student defeated the master. But the ghost did not die there. Hannibal survived, and his post-war life is perhaps even more revealing than his battles. He tried to reform Carthage. He tried to break the power of the corrupt oligarchy, the very men who had starved his expedition. He tried to make the city a republic of laws rather than a playground for the rich. And for this, his own people betrayed him to Rome. He went into exile. The old lion, grey and tired, moving from court to court in the east, Syria, Crete, Bithynia, trying to raise one last coalition against the consuming fire of Rome. The Romans hunted him. They could not rest as long as he drew breath. He was an obsession. Flamininus, a Roman general, finally cornered him in a small village in what is now Turkey. The house was surrounded. There was no escape. Hannibal had carried a secret with him for years. A ring. It was not a piece of jewellery for vanity. It contained a reservoir of poison. He had always known this moment would come. He had prepared to control his own exit. His final words are recorded by Livy, and they drip with a weary, devastating sarcasm. "Let us release the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too long to wait for the death of an old man." He drank the poison. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a triumph. He did not let them parade him through the streets of Rome in chains. He erased himself. But in a way, Hannibal won. He changed Rome forever. To defeat him, Rome had to become him. They had to abandon their citizen militia and build a professional, ruthless military machine. They had to become an empire of conquest to ensure they were never threatened again. The Republic died at Cannae. The empire was born in the reaction to it. Scipio Aemilianus, the man weeping over the flames of Carthage years later, was the adopted grandson of the Scipio who defeated Hannibal. The shadow of the chaotic genius hung over the entire destruction. The lands of southern Italy, where Hannibal campaigned, never fully recovered. The small farmers were wiped out, replaced by massive slave plantations owned by the rich, the latifundia. The ecological and economic damage he wrought permanently altered the Italian landscape. He left scars on the geography itself. So, when we see the smoke rising from Carthage in 146 BC, we must realize that the fire was lit 50 years earlier. It was lit by the fear of one man. Rome was trying to exorcise a ghost. They burned the city to ensure that no second Hannibal could ever rise from that soil. They salted the earth, metaphorically if not literally, to sterilize the womb that produced him. But as the smoke clears and the ghost of Hannibal fades into the mist of Anatolia, we are left with a physical reality of the devastation. The city is gone. The people are enslaved or dead. The library is ash. The line of Hannibal is extinguished. Now the Romans must deal with the land itself, the fertile, dark soil of the Medjerda Valley, the granary that Hannibal had tried to protect. What happens to a garden when the gardener is murdered? We move from the fire of the city to the silence of the fields. We must investigate the most famous myth of the destruction, the salt and the soil. There is a specific image that has lodged itself in the collective memory of the West, a picture so vivid that it's often taught as fact in schoolrooms before the ink on the textbook is even dry. It is the image of a Roman general, or perhaps a team of oxen, dragging a plough across the smoking ruins of Carthage, and behind them, men sowing the furrows not with seeds, but with salt. It is the ultimate symbol of sterility. It says, "Not only is your city dead, but the earth that held it is dead. Nothing will ever grow here again." It is a powerful, terrifying closure to the story. But tonight we must ask a quiet, uncomfortable question. Did it actually happen? Or is the salt a metaphor that we have mistaken for a memory? When we look at the ancient sources, Polybius, Appian, Plutarch, the men who actually lived near the event or had access to the records, we find a strange omission. None of them mention the salt, not one. The story of salting the earth seems to appear centuries later, perhaps an invention of 19th century historians projecting biblical imagery onto the Roman past. After all, in the Book of Judges, Abimelech destroys Shechem and sows it with salt. It is a literary trope, a poetic way of saying forever. Consider the logic of it. Salt, in the ancient world, was valuable. It was money, the root of our word salary. To salt the sprawling hinterlands of Carthage would have required a logistical operation almost as expensive as the war itself. And more importantly, why would Rome poison the prize they had just spent a century fighting to obtain? Rome was a hungry beast. It had a massive teeming population that was constantly on the verge of riot due to grain shortages. They didn't want a desert, they wanted a farm. They didn't destroy Carthage to kill the soil, they destroyed Carthage to steal the harvest. However, just because they didn't use physical salt doesn't mean they didn't perform a ritual of sterilization. The Romans believed in the power of the word. Before the physical destruction, Scipio likely performed a ritual known as evocatio, calling the gods of Carthage to abandon the city and come to Rome, where they would be treated better. And then, the devotio or execratio. This was a formal cursing of the site. The priests would have stood before the burning walls and intoned a legalistic prayer, dedicating the city to the infernal gods, declaring the ground sacer, sacred, but in the sense of being accursed, untouchable, taboo. So, the salting was psychic. It was a barrier of fear placed around the ruins of the Byrsa. For 100 years, no one was allowed to live on the site of the city itself. It remained a ghost town, a heap of rubble inhabited only by hyenas and scavengers. But outside that cursed circle, the land was immediately put to work. We must remember Mago's book on agriculture, the one Rome saved from the fire. The Carthaginians were not just sailors, they were geniuses of the soil. They had turned North Africa into a garden. They understood irrigation, crop rotation, and the grafting of fruit trees in a way that the Romans had yet to master. The archaeological record shows a landscape of diverse abundance: olives, grapes, figs, pomegranates, almonds. It was a polyculture, a balanced ecosystem that mimicked nature. When Rome took over, the logic of the land changed. The Pax Romana brought a brutal efficiency. The diverse gardens of the Punic lords were ripped up and replaced with a monoculture: wheat. Endless rolling oceans of wheat to feed the mob in Rome. North Africa became the granary of the empire. If you eat a loaf of bread in Rome in the 1st century AD, the flour likely came from the soil that Hannibal once walked upon. There is a melancholy in this transformation. The land was stripped of its identity. It was turned into a factory. The Romans built massive cadastral grids, dividing the organic rolling hills into perfect squares for taxation and distribution to colonists. They squeezed the earth, and the earth eventually grew tired. Some environmental historians suggest that the relentless Roman demand for grain, combined with the deforestation required to fuel the baths and industries, began the slow process of desertification that affects the region to this day. The salt wasn't poured by Scipio. It rose from the water table over centuries of overexploitation. We can see the ghosts of this exploitation in the landscape today. If you walk through the Tunisian countryside, you can still find the Fossa Regia, the royal ditch. It was the boundary line dug by Scipio to mark the territory of the conquered province. It is a scar on the earth that has lasted 2,000 years. It marked the edge of this civilized world, the line between the Roman wheat fields and the barbarian nomads. But there is a deeper theft here. By turning Carthage into a farm, Rome erased the memory of Carthage as a civilization. They reduced a rival empire to a collection of tenant farmers. The Punic people didn't vanish. They were still there, bending their backs in the sun, harvesting the grain that would be shipped to the city that burned their homes. They spoke a dialect of Punic in the countryside for another 500 years. St. Augustine, centuries later, noted that the peasants still called themselves Hanani, Canaanites. They remembered who they were, even if the world had forgotten. The tragedy of the soil is silent. It doesn't scream like a dying soldier. It just slowly loses its colour. The wind blows the topsoil away. The aqueducts, once the veins of the empire, eventually crumble. But in 146 BC, the soil was still rich, dark, and heavy with potential. Rome had secured its stomach. They had the land. But Carthage was never just a land power. The soul of Carthage was not in the dirt but in the waves. Rome could occupy the territory, they could plough the fields, they could curse the hill of the citadel. But they could not occupy the horizon. The Carthaginians were a thalassocracy, a kingdom of the sea. And the sea is harder to conquer than the land. It leaves no tracks. It holds no monuments. As we stand in the silent wheat fields of the Roman province of Africa, we can feel the breeze picking up, coming from the north, carrying the salt spray of the Mediterranean. It calls us back to the water. It calls us to the places where the Roman legions could not march. We must leave the solid ground now. We must drift out past the breakers into the blue unknown. We need to look for the traces of the ships that didn't come back, the trade routes that were kept secret even under torture. Did the knowledge of the world die with the library, or did it survive in the currents? The waves are washing against the shore, erasing the footprints in the sand, but perhaps they are also hiding something. Stand on the westernmost tip of Europe, on the cliffs of Sagres or the jagged rocks of Cornwall, and look out. What do you see? To the modern eye, the Atlantic is a highway, a known quantity crossed by cables and flight paths. But to the ancient eye, to the Roman eye, that grey, heaving expanse was the end of reality. They called it the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. They believed the water eventually boiled, or that the edge of the world simply dropped off into a void of mist and monsters. But for the Carthaginians, this terror was a tool. It was a curtain they kept drawn to hide the backstage of the world. While Rome was building roads to march on solid ground, Carthage was weaving a web of currents and winds that no one else could see. We have spoken of the fire that consumed the city and the plough that broke the soil. But how do you destroy a path that is made of water? The wake of a ship lasts only for a few minutes before the ocean erases it. This is the genius of the thalassocracy, the empire of the sea. It leaves no ruins. And because it leaves no ruins, it leaves room for the most unsettling question of all. How far did they actually go? The Romans knew the Mediterranean. It was a lake, a known pond. But the Carthaginians passed through the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and turned left and right into the unknown. We know they reached Britain. The tin mines of Cornwall were the secret engine of the Bronze Age, and later, a critical resource for the ancient economy. The Greeks knew the tin came from the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, but they didn't know where they were. Carthage kept the map in their head. There is a famous story recorded by the geographer Strabo that perfectly encapsulates the Phoenician secret. A Carthaginian captain sailing north toward the tin mines noticed a Roman ship trailing him. The Roman was shadowing him, trying to learn the route. The Carthaginian captain didn't try to outrun him. Instead, he deliberately steered his own ship onto a treacherous shoal, wrecking it. The Roman ship, following blindly, crashed as well and was destroyed. The Carthaginian captain survived, swam to shore, and returned to Carthage. Instead of being punished for losing a ship, he was paid the value of the cargo from the public treasury. He was a hero. He had destroyed the vessel to save the secret. This level of state commitment to silence suggests that what they were protecting was not just a market, but a monopoly on the shape of the world. They spread disinformation. They told stories of sea serpents, of seaweed thick enough to trap a ship forever, of waters that were too thick to row through. They weaponized the superstitious fears of their rivals to keep the Atlantic empty. But there are whispers that the blockade was not just about tin. In 1749, on the island of Corvo in the Azores, almost 1,000 miles out into the middle of the Atlantic, a pot of coins was reportedly found by a storm. They were Carthaginian and Cyrenaican coins. Archaeologists have debated this for centuries. Were they dropped by a much later sailor? Or did a Punic ship, blown off course or perhaps exploring, reach these islands long before the Portuguese discovered them? If they reached the Azores, they were a third of the way to the Americas. And then there are the currents. If you sail out of the Mediterranean and catch the Canary Current south, it acts like a conveyor belt. It pulls you down the coast of Africa, and then, near the Cape Verde Islands, the trade winds pick you up and push you west, straight toward Brazil. It is a one-way highway. To come back, you must go north and catch the westerlies. It is a giant clockwise loop. It is physically possible that Carthaginian ships were pulled into this cycle. Did they touch the New World? There are no accepted cities, no undeniable forts, but there are anomalies. Roman amphorae found in the Bay of Guanabara in Brazil, the Bay of Jars, inscriptions on stones in North America that some linguists claim resemble Punic script, though most dismiss them as hoaxes or pareidolia. The academic consensus says no, but the silence of the archives leaves the door ajar. If they did land there, and if they did map it, those maps burned in 146 BC. We may be living in a version of history where the discovery of the Americas was delayed by 1,500 years because a Roman soldier held a torch to a shelf of scrolls. Think of the ships themselves. The Roman trireme was a battering ram with oars, designed for coastal fighting. The Carthaginian merchant vessels were rounder, deeper, designed to ride the swells. They were sewn together with mortise and tenon joints, flexible enough to handle the breathing of the ocean. On their prows they painted large staring eyes, the oculi. These were not just decoration. They were there to help the ship see the route. In the fog of the Atlantic, where the stars are hidden, the ship became a living thing, a partner in the mystery. The loss of this maritime culture is not just a loss of geography, it is a loss of a way of thinking. The Romans were linear. A road goes from point A to point B. It conquers the landscape, but the sea is fluid. You cannot conquer a wave, you must ride it. You must negotiate with the wind. The Carthaginian mind was likely more flexible, more adaptive, less rigid than the Roman mind. They were middlemen, translators, people of the borderlands. When Rome destroyed them, Europe turned inward. The ocean became a wall again. We stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at the ground. We often wonder why the Industrial Revolution or the Age of Discovery didn't happen sooner. Perhaps it almost did. The Antikythera mechanism, that ancient Greek computer, shows we had the mechanics. The Library of Carthage may have held the geography. The pieces were there, but the system was smashed. The great year turned, and winter came for knowledge. Scipio destroyed the fleet. He took the 500 warships of Carthage, towed them out of the harbour, and burned them in full view of the city. It must have looked like the sea itself was on fire. The skeletons of the great galleys drifted and sank, becoming reefs for the fish. The wood rotted, the iron nails rusted. But the true tragedy is that the software of the sea, the oral traditions of the pilots, the mnemonic rhymes used to remember the stars, the intuitive understanding of the swell, died with the men who were sold into slavery to work in Roman mines. A miner does not need to know the stars. The sea is the ultimate eraser. It swallows evidence. But there is one thing that is even more fragile than a ship, more fleeting than a wake. It is the breath used to speak a name. A civilization is defined by its language, the specific sounds it makes to describe reality. When Carthage fell, a silence descended that was far more profound than the absence of noise. It was the absence of meaning. The Punic tongue, which had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, began its slow, suffocating death. We have lost the maps. Now we must watch the loss of the voice. What is the sound of a ghost? We usually imagine it as a creaking floorboard or a rustle of curtains, but perhaps the true sound of a ghost is a word spoken in a language that no one left alive can understand. We have walked through the burning streets, we have sailed the forbidden ocean, and we have touched the salted earth. But the most intimate destruction of Carthage was not the demolition of its walls. It was the silencing of its throat. A civilization is more than its architecture. It is its voice. It is the specific vibration of air that allows a mother to comfort her child, a captain to command his crew, or a priest to petition the void. When Carthage fell, the Punic language, the tongue of Dido, of Hamilcar, of Hannibal, began a slow, suffocating descent into the dark. Consider the tragedy of a lost language. It is not just a loss of vocabulary. A language is a lens. It is a unique architecture of thought. The way the Carthaginians described the colour of the sea, the way they distinguish between different types of wind, the words they used for honour or debt or fate, these were not just labels. They were concepts that existed only within the framework of their culture. Punic was a Semitic language, a sister to Hebrew and Phoenician. It was guttural, rhythmic, rich in consonants, a language born in the deserts of the Levant and transplanted to the coast of Africa. It was the sound of the East in the West. When the Romans arrived, they brought Latin. Latin is a language of law, of order, of engineering. It marches, it clicks into place like a legion. The Romans imposed their tongue not just by force, but by utility. If you wanted to sue your neighbour, you did it in Latin. If you wanted to sell your grain to the state, you did it in Latin. If you wanted to be a citizen, you spoke Latin. Punic was pushed out of the forum, out of the courts and back into the kitchen, the bedroom and the field. It became a low language, a patois of the conquered. But there is a strange and haunting artifact that survives from this era of erasure. It is not a stone inscription, but a joke. In a play by the Roman comedian Plautus, titled Penulus, the Little Carthaginian, written while Carthage still stood or shortly after, there is a character named Hanno. In the play, Hanno speaks. He delivers a monologue in his native tongue. For centuries, Roman audiences laughed at this speech. To them it sounded like gibberish, the funny noises of a barbarian. But to modern linguists, this passage is a diamond. It is the only substantial, continuous sample of spoken Punic that we possess. Stop and think about the irony. The only reason we can hear the voice of Carthage today is because the Romans wanted to mock it. They preserved the sound of their enemy in a comedy routine. In those lines, Hanno is praying to the gods, asking for the return of his kidnapped daughters. It is a prayer of desperation, preserved in a vessel of laughter. It reminds us that history is often a game of telephone where the message is distorted by the bias of the listener. We hear Carthage, but we hear it through a Roman filter, twisted into a caricature. Yet a language is a stubborn thing. It hides in the landscape. It retreats to the mountains. Even after the city was burned and the library vaporized, the people in the countryside did not stop speaking Punic. They were farmers, the Chanani. They had no use for Latin. The language survived underground for centuries, like a root system waiting for rain. We see a ghostly resurgence of this 300 years after the fall. In 193 AD, a man named Septimius Severus became the Emperor of Rome. He was from Lepsis Magna, a Punic city in North Africa. Historical sources tell us that he spoke Latin with a heavy Punic accent. Imagine this: the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, sitting on the throne of the Caesars, speaking with the vowels and the rhythm of Hannibal. The ghost had captured the palace. It is said that his sister, when she visited him in Rome, spoke such poor Latin that the embarrassment forced him to send her home. It shows us that the culture of Carthage had not vanished. It had merely submerged. But eventually the silence wins. The Neo-Punic script, a cursive, flowing alphabet that evolved from the monumental Phoenician letters, gradually disappears from the tombstones. The names change. A man named Hamilcar names his son Marcus. The gods Baal and Tanit are renamed Saturn and Calestis. This is the process of syncretism, which is a polite word for digestion. Rome ate the Carthaginian gods and gave them Roman masks. By the time of St. Augustine in the 5th century AD, more than 500 years after the destruction, Punic was on its deathbed. Augustine, living in Hippo, modern Algeria, mentions that he needs to find priests who speak Punic to minister to the rural peasants. He cites Punic words to explain Hebrew concepts in his sermons. He is the last witness. After Augustine, the candle flickers out. The Arab conquest arrives in the 7th century, bringing a new Semitic language, Arabic, which absorbs the remnants of Punic like a drop of water falling into the sea. What did we lose in that silence? We lost the Carthaginian literature that might have offered an alternative to the Greek and Roman classics. We are raised on the Iliad and the Aeneid. We know the hero's journey from the perspective of Achilles and Aeneas. But what was the Carthaginian epic? Did they have a poem about the founding of their city? Did they have a tragedy about the death of Dido that didn't paint her as a hysterical lover, but as a queen betrayed by a political alliance? Language shapes reality. The Greeks gave us a language of philosophy and abstraction. The Romans gave us a language of law and duty. The Carthaginians might have given us a language of trade, of fluid borders, of the negotiation between the human and the divine. We will never know. We are trapped in the linguistic house that Rome built. There is a profound loneliness in looking at a Punic stele in a museum today. You see the letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, slashed into the limestone. You know they represent sounds, breath, meaning. But without the living tongue to animate them, they are just scratches. It is like looking at a sheet of music for an instrument that no longer exists. You can see the melody, but you cannot hear it. The silence of Carthage is not just the absence of noise, it is the absence of a counter-argument. Rome became the soliloquy of the West. Without Carthage to debate with, to trade with, to fight with, Rome began to talk only to itself. And when an empire talks only to itself, it begins to go mad. The voice is gone, the books are burned, the maps are lost, the ground is salted. But Rome was not content with leaving a void. A void is dangerous because it invites questions. A void is a vacuum. Rome needed to fill the space. They needed to build something on top of the corpse to weigh it down, to ensure it never rose again. And so, 100 years after the fire, they did the unthinkable. They returned. They didn't come to mourn, they came to build. They decided to create a new Carthage, a Roman Carthage, a perfect replica of their own order, placed directly on top of the chaotic energy of the past. We move now from the erasure to the overwriting. We must explore the concept of the palimpsest, a manuscript where the old writing is scraped off to make room for the new. But the old ink never truly vanishes. It bleeds through. We must walk the streets of the new city, the colony of Julius Caesar and Augustus, and see how the ghosts of the old Punic world haunted the foundations of the new Roman metropolis. The stones were new, but the nightmares were old. 100 years is a long time for a ghost to walk alone. For a century after the fire, the site of Carthage was a forbidden zone. It was a black spot on the map, inhabited only by scavenging birds, hyenas, and the poor, desperate squatters who scavenged the rubble for scrap lead and bronze. The curse of Scipio held the land in a kind of stasis. The Romans called it locus celeratius, a wicked place. But land is too valuable to remain cursed forever, especially land this good. The granary of North Africa was feeding Rome, but it lacked a capital. It lacked a port to ship the grain. And so, the very empire that murdered the city decided to resurrect it. But this was not an act of redemption. It was the ultimate act of colonization. To truly conquer a people, you do not just destroy their home, you build your home on top of their bones. We enter the era of the palimpsest. In the ancient world, parchment was expensive. If a scribe wanted to write a new text but had no fresh paper, he would take an old scroll, scrape off the ink of the previous story, and write the new words over the faint erased traces of the old. This is what Rome did to Carthage. They scraped the earth clean. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar, a man who respected no boundaries, saw the potential of the site. He planned the colony. It was his adopted son Augustus, the first emperor, who executed the vision. They named it Colonia Julia Concordia Carthago. Notice the name, Concordia, harmony. A cynical name for a city built on a genocide. The construction of Roman Carthage was an act of geological violence. The centre of the old Punic city was the Byrsa Hill, the high citadel where the temple of Eshmun had burned. It was a steep, craggy height. The Roman engineers, with their obsession for order and flat plains, looked at this sacred hill and decided it was too messy. It was too Punic. So they decapitated it. They brought in legions of labourers and literally sliced the top off the mountain. They moved an estimated 100,000 cubic metres of earth, dumping the debris down the sides of the hill to create a massive flat platform. Think about this. The ruins of the Punic citadel, the ashes of the library, the bones of the defenders, all of it was shoved down the slope to become landfill. Then, on the shaved scalp of the hill, the Romans poured concrete. They built a massive forum. They erected temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Capitoline Triad. They imposed the grid. The Roman grid is a weapon of geometry. It consists of the cardo, north-south axis, and the decumanus, east-west axis. It forces the landscape to submit to the right angle. Where the Punic streets had been winding, organic, designed to break the wind and create shade, the Roman streets were wide, straight, and exposed. They replaced the mystery of the labyrinth with the clarity of the prison yard. But here is the haunting property of a palimpsest. The old text always bleeds through. Over time, the ink of the original writing begins to ghost its way to the surface. You can scrape the stone, but you cannot scrape the genus loci, the spirit of the place. Rome built a perfect Roman city, with baths, a theatre, an amphitheatre, and an aqueduct that snaked for miles through the mountains. It became the second largest city in the western half of the empire. It was glorious, it was rich, but it was strange. The gods of Carthage refused to leave. The Romans built a temple to Calestis, the heavenly goddess. But everyone knew who she really was. She was Tanit. She'd simply put on a Roman toga. The people still worshipped her with a fervour that made the Romans uncomfortable. They depicted her riding a lion, holding a thunderbolt. The fierce feminine energy of the Punic religion bubbled up through the cracks in the Roman pavement. The statues were Roman, but the prayers whispered in the shadows were Punic. Even the people were a palimpsest. The settlers were Roman veterans and Italian farmers, but they intermarried with the local population. The DNA mixed. A new culture emerged, Romano-African. It was vibrant, intellectual, and slightly dangerous. It produced men like Apuleius, the author of The Golden Ass, a novel full of magic, shape-shifting, and Eastern mystery. It produced Tertullian and Cyprian, the fiery fathers of the early church. The Christianity that developed in Carthage was not the polite philosophical Christianity of Greece. It was bloody, intense, obsessed with martyrdom and purity. It carried the shadow of the Tophet. It was a religion of absolute sacrifice. Did the memory of the children in the fire transmute into the memory of the martyrs in the arena? The Roman amphitheatre in Carthage was one of the largest in the world. It could hold 30,000 spectators. Beneath the stands, in the dark cells where the gladiators and wild beasts waited, the air must have been heavy. This was the place where Perpetua and Felicity were fed to the beasts for their Christian faith. The crowd cheered. The blood soaked into the sand. Was it the same blood? The Romans believed they had brought civilization to Africa. They ended the barbaric rituals of the Carthaginians. Yet they built a stone circle to watch human beings be torn apart by animals for entertainment. They replaced a ritual of sacrifice with a ritual of sadism. The city had changed, but the hunger of the earth for blood remained constant. Walking through the ruins of Roman Carthage today, for these are the ruins you mostly see when you visit Tunisia, is a disorienting experience. You see the Antonine baths, massive arches of brick and stone facing the sea. They are monumental. They speak of the power of Rome to heat water and pump it thousands of miles, but they feel heavy. There is a hubris of stone here. The Romans built as if they would be there forever. They paved over the Punic harbour, turning the military circle into a commercial quay. They tried to turn the engine of war into a shopping mall. But the irony of the palimpsest is that the new text eventually fades too. The Roman ink was not indelible. The cycle of the great year that Scipio feared kept turning. The Vandals, Germanic barbarians, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and took the city in 439 AD. They didn't burn it, they moved in. The Roman aristocrats were evicted. The baths began to crumble. Then came the Byzantines trying to restore the glory of Rome, but it was a pale imitation. And finally, the Arabs in the 7th century. When the Arabs arrived, they didn't just conquer Carthage, they abandoned it. They looked at this massive, cursed pile of stone and decided to build their own city, Tunis, a few miles inland. Carthage became a quarry. For 1,000 years, the marble columns of the Roman Forum were looted to build the mosques of Kairouan and Tunis and the palaces of Europe. The marble of Carthage is in the Cathedral of Pisa. It is in the palaces of Genoa. The city was dismantled block by block and scattered across the world. So the Roman palimpsest was scraped away too. First the Punic, then the Roman, then the Vandal, then the Byzantine. Layer upon layer of vanity, all reduced to a quarry. The hill of the Byrsa, which the Romans had sliced flat, is now crowned by a 19th century French cathedral, the Acropolium, a Christian church sitting on a Roman forum, sitting on a Punic temple. It is a vertical stack of conquerors, each one believing they were the final version of history. But as we stand on that flattened hill tonight, looking out over the Gulf of Tunis, the lights of the modern city flickering in the distance, we must ask ourselves, What is the final truth of this place? Is it the fire of Scipio, the salt, the Roman concrete? Or is it the wind that blows from the sea, eroding them all equally? The Romans tried to overwrite the memory of Carthage with a grid of law and stone. They succeeded for a while, but stone cracks, empires tire, and the silence always returns. We are nearing the end of our journey. The fire has burned out, the city has been rebuilt and destroyed again. Now we must sit in the true void. We must listen to the echo that remains when all the walls are gone. We must ask the final question. What does the fall of Carthage warn us about our own future? And so we return to the beginning, which is also the end. We return to the hill overlooking the bay, standing beside Scipio Aemilianus, as the last embers of the city turn from orange to black. The shouting has stopped. The screams have been swallowed by the smoke. There is only the sound of the wind hissing through the gaps where the walls used to be. We have travelled through the anatomy of a destruction, from the harbour to the library, from the altar of the Tophet to the salted fields. We have seen how a civilization is dismantled bone by bone, word by word. But as the darkness settles over the Mediterranean tonight, we are left with the final, haunting question. What does the silence of Carthage say to us? Scipio's tears were not a performance, they were a prophecy. When he quoted Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish," he was acknowledging the terrifying symmetry of time. He understood the great year, the cosmic winter that eventually comes for every harvest. He knew that the very act of destroying Carthage was the mechanism that would eventually destroy Rome. By removing the rival, he removed the check on Rome's ambition. He removed the fear that kept them disciplined. Without Carthage, Rome became bloated, corrupt, and eventually it too fell. It took centuries, but the clock started ticking the moment the last Carthaginian roof collapsed. We often look at history as a straight line, a march of progress leading inevitably to us. We sit in our climate-controlled rooms, surrounded by our digital screens, and we feel safe. We feel that we have escaped the brutal logic of the ancient world. We think our cities are too big to fail, our knowledge too distributed to burn. But Carthage was the modern world of its day. It was the hub of global trade. It was a city of multi-story apartments, centralized plumbing, and complex banking. Its citizens worried about interest rates, political scandals, and the latest fashions from the East. They watched the sunset over the Kothon and believed, just as we do, that their way of life was the permanent state of reality. The fall of Carthage is a reminder of the hubris of stone. We build in concrete and steel because we want to enforce our will upon the future. We want to say, "I was here." But the earth is patient. The earth waits. The fire of 146 BC proved that even the most advanced hardware, the massive walls, the warships, the hydro-engineering, is fragile. But the software, the culture, the language, the beliefs, is even more fragile. It can be deleted in a generation. Think of our own library of ash. We store our collective memory not on scrolls but on servers, in the cloud, a word that sounds ethereal, but really means vast warehouses of magnetic drives that require constant electricity and cooling. If the power were to go out, if the magnet were to pass over the drive, our history would not even leave a pile of ash. It would simply vanish into a sequence of zeros. We are perhaps more vulnerable than the Carthaginians. At least Margot's book on agriculture could be pulled from the fire. You cannot pull a hard drive from a solar flare. There is a concept in philosophy called hauntology, the idea that the present is haunted by the ghosts of lost futures. Carthage is a ghost of a future that never happened. If Hannibal had won, or if the Senate in Rome had chosen mercy, the trajectory of the human species would have been radically different. We might have inherited a world based on the Punic model, a federation of trading states, fluid, maritime, focused on the exchange of goods rather than the conquest of land. We might have discovered the Americas 1,000 years earlier. We might have avoided the dark ages that followed the collapse of Rome. Or perhaps it would have been worse. Perhaps the fires of the Tophet would have spread to London and Paris. Perhaps the oligarchy of merchants would have created a world of absolute commodification, where everything, including life, was for sale. We cannot know. The silence of the void offers no answers, only the echo of "what if?" This is the seductive danger of the ruin. It allows us to project our own anxieties onto the blank canvas of the past. When we stand in the dust of Tunisia, we're not really mourning the Carthaginians. We don't know them well enough to mourn them. We are mourning ourselves. We are mourning the eventual erasure of our own names, our own cities, our own struggles. We are looking at the skull and realizing it is a mirror. Scipio died in mysterious circumstances years later, possibly murdered by his own family. The Roman Republic collapsed into dictatorship. The Vandals came, the Byzantines came, the Arabs came, the French came, and now the tourists come. They walk over the buried streets, taking photos, buying souvenirs, unaware that they are walking on a crime scene that changed the world. The dust they brush off their sandals contains the DNA of a vanished people. So, as you lie in the dark, listening to the quiet, let your mind drift over the map of the world. Visualize the cities glowing in the night: New York, Tokyo, London, Shanghai. They seem so bright, so undeniable. But close your eyes and imagine the lights flickering. Imagine the sound of the wind picking up. Imagine the slow, creeping return of the sand. History is not a solid ground. It is a thin crust over a deep ocean of forgetfulness. We are sailing on a ship made of memory, and the hull is leaking. The fall of Carthage is not a story about them. It is a story about the fragility of us. It is a whisper that says, everything you love can be burned. Everything you know can be forgotten, and the sun will rise the next morning, indifferent to your absence. But there is a strange peace in this realization. If nothing lasts, then the pressure to be immortal is lifted. If the great walls of the Beerza could not hold back the tide, then perhaps we do not need to build walls around our own lives. We can accept the flow. We can accept that we are temporary. We can be like the Carthaginian navigators, trusting the waves, reading the stars and sailing into the dark with our eyes open, even if we don't know where the edge of the world lies. The fire is out now. The legionaries have marched away, the ships have sunk, the weeping general has gone home to die. The scene is empty. There is only the moon, reflecting off the dark water of the bay, and the sound of the waves beating against the shore, rhythmically, endlessly, washing the stones clean. Wash, sleep, forget. The wind blows over the ruins, and it does not speak Latin. It does not speak Punic. It speaks the only language that is truly eternal: silence.